In the far reaches of the galaxy, where stars gleamed like diamonds and alien worlds spun silently in the darkness, there was a story that no one wanted to talk about. It was a story of rejection. A story about a princess who had everything. A royal bloodline, beauty that could captivate entire worlds, and a mind sharp enough to outwit even the brightest of aliens. And yet she was alone. Princess Lyra of the Verica people stood in the grand halls of her palace, looking out over the shimmering city below. Her tiny, delicate figure seemed almost out of place in the towering architecture of her homeworld. She wasn't like the towering, muscular males of the galaxy who made their presence known with brute strength and pride. She was different. She was small, fragile, and most importantly, she was alone. It wasn't for lack of suitors. No, the galaxy had seen Princess Lyra and recognized her beauty. But there was one problem, the same problem that always seemed to come up whenever anyone got too close to her. Her species, the Verica, were different. They were small, delicate beings, known for their intelligence and their beauty, but they were also feared, not because of their power or their size, but because of the gifts they carried. The Verica had abilities. Their kind could manipulate energy, see through time in flashes, and communicate without speaking. A power that terrified many alien species across the galaxy. And so, when Princess Lyra came of age, she had been offered to the greatest of the galaxy's leaders and warlords. They came from all corners of the universe. Tall, strong beings who thought they could have anything they wanted. They thought they could claim the most beautiful princess in the galaxy. But every single one of them turned her down. One after the other, these powerful, feared beings rejected Princess Lyra. They didn't want her. Not because she wasn't beautiful or intelligent, but because she was different. The males of the galaxy found her too small, too delicate, too unpredictable. Her species wasn't like theirs. While the Verica held incredible abilities, they were also fragile, both physically and mentally. They had to be handled carefully, and many found that idea unappealing. The truth was that most of the galaxy's most powerful beings were used to control, to domination. They wanted women who would stand beside them in strength, who would produce heirs to carry on their powerful legacies. But Princess Lyra wasn't like that. She didn't fit into their idea of what a partner should be. In her heart, she knew this. It was why she had been alone for so long. She wasn't just a princess. She was a pawn, trapped in a game she hadn't asked to play. And each rejection made it clearer to her that she was nothing more than a disappointment in the eyes of those she once thought could be her allies. The last of the powerful suitors, a warlord named Sarak, had been the final blow. He had promised to stand by her side, to give her the power she needed to lead her people. She had hoped, for just a moment, that he might be different, but when the time came, he left her in the cold, silent halls of the palace, his words echoing in her ears. "You are not what we need." Those words haunted her. It wasn't just about being rejected for her looks or her abilities. It was about being rejected for what she was, not just an individual, but a symbol. The symbol of a species that had been cast aside. The symbol of something too different, too fragile for the harshness of the galaxy. Princess Lyra sank down onto a cushioned chair, her small form barely visible against the luxurious fabric of her royal robes. The glow of distant stars flickered outside, casting a soft, silvery light into the room. It was in this light that she saw herself reflected in the window, small, delicate, and incredibly alone. Why had this happened? She wondered. Why was she cursed with such beauty, such power, and yet so little worth in the eyes of others? She ran a hand over her face, frustrated with herself. She could not help the way she had been born. She could not help her size, her appearance, or her people's mysterious powers. And yet she had been rejected time and time again. Even now, as she looked out over her world, she could feel the weight of her isolation pressing down on her chest. The future of her people rested on her shoulders, but no one seemed to care. She was trapped in a world where no one saw her as strong. No one believed in her. They saw her as fragile, delicate, a princess who could never hold her own against the warriors and rulers of the galaxy. She was no one's choice. But that was when it happened. Just as she was about to surrender to the sadness that seemed to cling to her every thought, she heard a voice. It was a soft, almost hesitant voice, human, unmistakably human. "Princess Lyra," the voice said, "I will stand by you." At first, she thought it was a mistake, a figment of her imagination. No human had ever traveled this far into the galaxy, and even if they had, what could a human possibly offer? Humans were primitive compared to the advanced species of the galaxy. They didn't have the powers or the knowledge. But this voice, this one human voice, was different. It was filled with something that made her pause. It was filled with sincerity. For the first time in years, Princess Lyra felt a spark of hope flicker within her. She stood from her seat and looked out the window, the city of her world sprawling below. Maybe, just maybe, there was someone who could see her for what she truly was. Maybe, just maybe, there was someone out there who would accept her, not despite her differences, but because of them. And that's when she made the decision. She would meet this human. Little did she know, this one simple decision would change the course of history forever. Princess Lyra stood at the edge of her balcony, staring out into the endless void of space. The stars twinkled like cold diamonds, indifferent to the struggles of those beneath them. Her world, the Verica homeworld, was beautiful, but she could no longer see its beauty through the haze of despair that clouded her mind. For years, she had been groomed for greatness, told that she would lead her people to victory, to a place of peace among the stars. But each rejection had broken a little piece of that dream. One after another, alien leaders and powerful warlords had come to her palace, eager to claim her as their own, only to leave when they saw the truth. She was too small, too weak, too different. None of them saw her for who she truly was, an intelligent, powerful being, capable of so much more than anyone realized. But she was a princess, and princesses didn't get to choose their fate. Her thoughts were interrupted when a soft, almost apologetic voice broke through her reverie. "Princess Lyra," it said. She turned quickly, startled to find a man standing in the doorway. A human. He was tall but not imposing, his features ordinary by galactic standards, yet there was something about him that seemed genuine. His eyes, though wide with curiosity, were not filled with the typical fear or uncertainty that most alien species exhibited when in her presence. His expression held something far more disarming: sincerity. "I know you don't know me," he said, his voice steady but filled with a quiet resolve. "But I couldn't help but hear your message. I want to help you." Lyra blinked in surprise. The human? It was unheard of for someone from Earth, a world not even recognized by the Galactic Council, to travel this far into the galaxy, especially for someone as insignificant as her. And yet, here he was, standing before her, offering to help without even knowing the full weight of the situation. There was no ulterior motive, no desire for power or influence. It was as if he was offering his assistance simply because he believed it was the right thing to do. Lyra took a step back, her heart racing. She had heard many similar offers from powerful beings, most of whom wanted something in return: a political alliance, a marriage contract, or an alliance forged by mutual interest. But this man, this human, had no such offers, no promises of grandeur. He was simply here, offering his help without any expectation. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you help me? You know nothing about me or my people. We're different. We've been rejected by every species in the galaxy." The human smiled softly, shaking his head. "I don't care about what others think," he replied. "I care about what's right. You don't deserve to be treated like this, and I believe you can do more than just hide in the shadows of your past. You deserve a chance. I don't know how, but I'll help you find it." Lyra's heart skipped a beat. She had never heard anyone speak like that before. No one had ever treated her like an equal, like a person who could stand beside someone and face the galaxy with strength. Most of the galaxy saw her as nothing more than a pawn, a fragile creature to be discarded or controlled. But this human, he was different. His words were simple, but they resonated with a depth that made her question everything she had believed about herself and her place in the universe. For a long moment, she stood there, looking into his eyes, trying to read the sincerity that she saw in his expression. But the truth was, she couldn't understand why someone like him would choose to help her. She was a symbol of failure to so many, a reminder of the Verika's fall from grace. And yet, here was this human, an outsider to her world, offering her something that none of the galaxy's most powerful beings had ever given her: hope. "I don't know what to say," she finally whispered. "I've been alone for so long. I've been rejected by everyone. I'm not the warrior the galaxy wants. I'm not even what my own people expected me to be." The human stepped forward, his expression softening. "You don't need to be a warrior," he said gently. "You just need to be yourself. The galaxy doesn't understand you, but that doesn't mean you don't have value. It doesn't mean you can't change things." Her mind raced. The words of every alien male, every warlord, every powerful leader who had turned her away echoed in her thoughts. "You're not strong enough. You're not what we need. You're too small, too fragile." They had all seen her as something to be discarded, something too different to be of any use. But here was a human, a race that was considered primitive by galactic standards, who saw something in her that no one else had. He saw her potential. He saw her humanity. For the first time in years, Princess Lyra felt the weight on her shoulders lift, just a little. She didn't have to prove herself to anyone else. She didn't have to fit into the mold that others had made for her. Maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to be the leader her people needed, without compromising who she truly was. But as she looked at the human standing before her, offering his hand without hesitation, she knew that this was only the beginning. The path ahead would not be easy. There were still enemies out there who would stop at nothing to destroy her. And the galaxy was not a place that welcomed weakness. But with this human by her side, maybe she could find a way to show the galaxy that she wasn't a symbol of fragility. She was a symbol of strength. And perhaps for the first time, she had someone who believed in her. The human smiled again, as if reading her thoughts. "I'm here, Princess," he said simply, "and I'll stand by you." And just like that, the last remaining piece of hope in Lyra's heart began to grow. Princess Lyra stood silently for a moment, her mind racing as she stared at the human before her. This man, this stranger, had appeared out of nowhere and offered her something no one else had: the simple gift of belief. In the galaxy, where power and politics often dictated one's worth, it was hard to fathom why a human would extend such an offer. Humans were considered weak by the galactic standards, barely a footnote in the annals of the intergalactic history. And yet here he was, standing before her, offering to fight by her side. As she studied him, the uncertainty in her heart began to shift. Lyra had always been seen as the fragile princess, a beautiful but delicate creature whose value was defined by her species' abilities. The Verika were known for their mental prowess, their ability to tap into energy and manipulate the very fabric of reality. But they were physically weak, and that weakness had made them easy targets. The galaxy had seen them as little more than pawns, useful, perhaps, but ultimately disposable. And now, once again, she was at the mercy of the galaxy's cruel game. She had been rejected by powerful aliens, turned away for being too fragile, and cast aside for being too small. There had always been some deeper, darker truth behind their words. A fear, maybe. A fear that she and her people might one day rise, that their strange abilities could make them a threat. That was why she was alone, why no one saw her for the leader she could be. But this human didn't look at her with fear or pity. His eyes were full of understanding, of something she hadn't seen in so long, a kind of clarity. He wasn't asking for anything in return. He wasn't trying to claim her as a prize or manipulate her into an alliance. He simply wanted to help. Lyra could feel her chest tighten as his words settled deep into her heart. It was impossible to ignore the weight of her past, the expectations, the rejections, the lies. It was so easy to believe that she would always be alone, that the universe would never see her as anything more than a delicate anomaly. But something in this human's calm, steady gaze stirred a flicker of hope deep inside her. Could it be possible? Could someone like him really see beyond her species, beyond the fragile princess persona? "Why me?" she finally asked, her voice trembling, unsure of how to even form the question. "You don't know anything about me, about my people. You're not even from this galaxy. You don't know what it means to carry this burden." The human tilted his head, his expression softening. "I don't know everything about you, princess. But what I do know is that you're not the sum of your people's fears. You're not your bloodline or your people's past. You're something more. And I believe in that." His words, so simple yet profound, took Lyra by surprise. She had spent her life being defined by her species' abilities, their history, their failures. No one had ever looked at her like this. No one had ever looked past her title, her race, her past. Lyra swallowed, trying to fight back the rush of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. The last time someone had looked at her with this kind of compassion, it had been her father. But that was long ago, and now her father's passing had left her with nothing but a crown to wear, an empty promise to fulfill. Her people had expected her to lead, to bring honor to their fallen empire, but she hadn't been able to do it. She hadn't been able to prove herself worthy. "Why should I trust you?" she asked, her voice shaking slightly. "Humans are nothing. You're no match for the dangers that lie ahead. I've seen what the galaxy is capable of. You don't understand what I'm up against." The human stepped closer, his tone firm but gentle. "Maybe I don't understand everything," he said, "but I do know that strength doesn't always come from power. It comes from choice. From standing up when everything seems stacked against you. You're not alone in this, princess. You have a choice. You can rise, and I'll be right here to help you." Lyra looked at him, really looked at him for the first time. He wasn't imposing, wasn't physically strong like the warlord she had turned away. But in his eyes, she saw something stronger than all the galaxy's armies combined. There was determination, and there was trust. Trust in her. For a long time, Lyra had wondered if she was truly alone, if she was destined to carry the weight of her people's past, their downfall, all by herself. She had long ago abandoned any hope of being anything more than a prisoner to her bloodline. But here, standing in front of her, was a chance to rewrite that story. "What do you want in return?" she asked, a little voice in her head telling her to be cautious. It was strange. No one had ever offered her something without expecting anything in return. He smiled softly, almost sadly. "I want nothing in return, princess. All I want is for you to see what I see. That you're more than what the galaxy believes you are." There was something about his words that resonated with Lyra. For the first time in years, she felt like she could breathe again. Maybe the universe wasn't against her after all. Maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to prove them all wrong. The human extended his hand, his gesture simple yet profound. "Will you let me help you, Princess Lyra?" Her heart raced as she looked at his outstretched hand. She had spent so much time rejecting the idea of trusting anyone. But this human, this stranger had shown her something no one else had. A chance. With trembling hands, Lyra reached out and took his hand. "Yes," she whispered, "I will." And in that moment, the princess made a choice that would change everything. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with danger, and filled with unimaginable challenges. But for the first time in her life, Lyra believed she wasn't alone. And for the first time, the galaxy would have to reckon with something far more powerful than they could ever anticipate. A human, standing beside her, was the beginning of something no one could have predicted. The last species that had been rejected by the galaxy was about to make its presence known. Princess Lyra's heart pounded in her chest as she gripped the human's hand. The warmth from his touch was strangely grounding, filling the void left by years of rejection and doubt. She had spent so long battling against the galaxy's perception of her and her people, and now, for the first time in her life, she had someone who believed in her not because of her bloodline or her race, but simply because they saw something worth fighting for. It wasn't lost on Lyra that this human was different from all the others who had come before him. His presence was calm, steady, like a quiet force pushing back against the chaos that surrounded her. In all her years of dealing with power-hungry species, political alliances, and the expectations placed on her as a princess, no one had ever offered her something as simple as trust. But this human didn't hesitate. He hadn't asked for a grand alliance, nor did he offer empty promises of fame or riches. All he wanted was to help her find a way to stand up and fight, not for her people's past, but for their future. Lyra pulled her hand back slowly, her mind swirling with thoughts of what was to come. She had always known that she could never achieve the greatness expected of her by her people, not with the power struggles, the fear, and the scars of the past holding her back. But standing here with the human, she felt a spark of hope she hadn't dared to dream of in years. She was no longer alone. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to consider the possibilities. With this human by her side, maybe she could finally reclaim control of her fate. Maybe she could lead her people in a way no one had ever expected, a way that wasn't defined by the weaknesses of her species, but by the strength of her own will. But to do that, she would need to move fast. The galaxy was full of threats, dangers that would never hesitate to strike when they saw an opportunity. Lyra turned to face the human. "I don't know what's out there waiting for us," she said quietly. "But I do know this. Whatever happens, I will need your help. We're not just fighting for my people's future anymore. We're fighting for every species who's been cast aside, for those who have been ignored. This is bigger than us." The human nodded, his face determined. "I'm ready," he said simply. "I'm ready to fight, just like you are. We'll face whatever comes together." But even as the words left his mouth, Lyra's mind flashed to the looming threats beyond her palace walls. She had been so caught up in her own fears and insecurities that she had failed to recognize the scale of the opposition she was about to face. The leaders who had rejected her were not merely individuals. They represented entire factions of the galaxy, powerful collectives with resources beyond her imagination. They would never tolerate the idea of a princess leading a rebellion, let alone a princess with a human by her side. Lyra's thoughts turned back to her past, how her people had once been proud, how they had once been respected. The Verica had long ago retreated from the political stage, their powers suppressed and ignored as their empire crumbled. Her family had tried to rebuild it, but every attempt had been met with hostility and disdain. Those who once admired the Verica now considered them weak, useless, too fragile to contribute to the galaxy's progress. And despite the protests of her advisors, despite her father's hopes for a brighter future, Lyra had been left in the shadows, seen only as a symbol of failure. Yet, standing here with the human, something was different. She was no longer the fragile princess the galaxy believed her to be. She had a chance to rewrite her destiny, but she had to act fast. "I know what we have to do," Lyra said, her voice steadying with newfound determination. "We need to gather allies, people who are willing to fight for a future where every species, no matter their size or strength, has a place. And I need to make sure that the galaxy knows that the Verica aren't weak. We may not be as strong as the rest of you, but we have something the galaxy has forgotten. A will to survive, to evolve, to fight for what's right." The human nodded again. "And I'll help you, every step of the way." Lyra felt a rush of gratitude, though she knew their journey would not be easy. The Galactic Council was a vast and complex entity, a web of politics and power that had kept many in place for centuries. To challenge it, to go against its deeply ingrained beliefs, would be dangerous. But it was clear that the galaxy needed change. The old systems were falling apart, and those in power were too stubborn to see it. "We need to start small," Lyra continued, her mind racing with plans. We need to find those who are already dissatisfied with the current order, those who've been overlooked, the ones who have nowhere to turn. They will be our first allies. From there, we can grow our movement. The human smiled, a gleam of excitement in his eyes. I know a few people. They might be willing to listen. Lyra looked at him with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. You know people who can help us. She had no doubt that humans were capable of surprising feats, but to think that this simple human, had the connections and knowledge to help her, to help the Verica, it was almost too good to be true. He chuckled softly, as if sensing her disbelief. You'd be surprised how much a little bit of trust can get you. The galaxy might think we're nothing, but it's those who've been cast aside who will stand with us. Trust me, Princess, this is just the beginning. And with that, the two of them set their sights on a future that no one had seen coming. The galaxy would soon find out that the Verica were not to be underestimated, and the human, who had defied all odds by offering his help, would be the one to stand beside her, making history. The path ahead was uncertain, and the challenges would be immense. But for the first time, Lyra felt a surge of something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. The war for her people's future, and for the future of every overlooked species, was only just beginning. Lyra and the human stood at the precipice of a new world, their path ahead unclear but filled with the weight of potential. The stars seemed to stretch endlessly before them, each one a reminder of the vastness of the galaxy, and the power that had been denied to those like her for so long. The Verica, fragile as they were, had been overlooked, disrespected, and discarded by a galaxy that prided itself on strength, violence, and control. Now, with the human by her side, she had a chance to reshape that narrative. As they made their way through the corridors of her palace, Lyra's mind raced with the strategy they needed to survive. The Galactic Council was a monolith of power, each member entrenched in their own interests, each one unwilling to bend or break. If they were to succeed, they needed to be clever, to strike when the galaxy's eyes were not focused on them. They needed to prove that the Verica, and by extension the human, were not to be ignored anymore. Lyra's thoughts were interrupted when a communicator beeped softly on her wrist. She glanced at it, her pulse quickening as she read the incoming message. It was from a contact she had kept secret for years, someone deep within the galactic political structure, a former ally, now a dissenter, someone who might be able to offer them the first real glimpse of power. She turned to the human, her voice low but urgent. I need to go. We have a chance to make our first move. You stay here, keep an eye on things, and make sure we don't attract any unwanted attention. The human gave her a knowing look. I'm with you, he said firmly. You're not alone in this, Lyra. She nodded, her heart swelling with an emotion she had long abandoned. Trust. As she left the room, her mind turned back to her people, the Verica, who had endured so much. It was time for them to rise, time for them to be seen not as fragile relics of a lost era, but as a force capable of shaping the galaxy's future. The journey was treacherous, and the challenges they would face were far from over. The dissenter she was meeting had warned her that the Galactic Council was already starting to take notice of the Verica's growing unrest. Whispers of rebellion had begun to spread, but there was still time to act, still time to turn the tide in their favor. But it would require more than just a human's help. It would take the courage and unity of the Verica, the strength of the human spirit, and the cunning of those who were willing to stand by them. As Lyra walked through the corridors of her palace, she knew that the weight of the galaxy's fate rested on her shoulders. It wasn't just about her or her people anymore. It was about something much larger. This was a fight for the future of the entire galaxy, against those who believed that only the strong had a place in it. She and the human would show them that even the weakest species could change the course of history. Even the most fragile princess could rise to lead. Outside, the sky was dark, the stars distant and cold. But within the palace, a fire had begun to burn, one that could not be extinguished. In the meeting chamber, the dissenter awaited her. He was a high-ranking official from one of the Galactic Council's most powerful factions, someone who had seen the corruption from within and was ready to break away. But betrayal was never without risk, and his life was now on the line. The fact that he was willing to speak with her meant that he had already chosen his side. Lyra entered the room, her presence commanding the attention of everyone present. The dissenter stood, his face grim, but his eyes bright with a spark of defiance. "Princess Lyra," he greeted her, his tone formal but respectful. "I was told you needed my help." She nodded, her voice steady and confident. "We do. The time for hiding is over. The Verica are no longer going to be pushed aside. And with your help, we will make sure that the Galactic Council knows that we are a force to be reckoned with." The dissenter raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued by her boldness. "And you think you can convince them? The Council won't just bow to some protest. You will need more than words to make them listen." "We don't need to convince them," Lyra replied, her eyes burning with conviction. "We just need to show them that the Verica aren't the weak species they think we are. And we have something they don't: unity. We have people who will stand with us, who have been waiting for someone to lead them. And we will take the first step toward that future today." The dissenter studied her carefully, then finally nodded. "You're right. The galaxy is changing, and I'll help you make sure the Verica aren't left behind." With that, the first pieces of their rebellion fell into place. The human, waiting back at the palace, would help spread the message, gather more support. Lyra and the dissenter would work to gather allies who had been silenced, oppressed, or simply overlooked. The Verica were not alone, not anymore. As the meeting ended and Lyra made her way back to her quarters, a sense of purpose filled her. The pieces were aligning. The fight wasn't just hers. It was the galaxy's, and she would not back down. They would be seen, they would be heard, and together they would rise. And as the human stood in the shadows, waiting for her return, he too felt the weight of what was about to unfold. It was just the beginning, but Lyra had already made the impossible seem possible. With every step they took, they were changing the fate of the galaxy. And nothing could stop them now.